So they did acknowledge that they were willing to make up a rule.
The question is, should NASCAR allow the teams to change the brake pads before the race? Is that the question?
Correct.
Of course they should.
Denny Hamlin walked into the NASCAR hauler at Iowa Speedway and offered to punish himself. Start on pit lane. Start at the rear the following week at Richmond Raceway. Anything as long as he could change the brake pads he believed were defective. NASCAR said no. So Hamlin asked what would happen if he simply refused to get in the car. The answer he says he received is the reason this story exploded. In his own words, so they did acknowledge it. They were willing to make up a rule. To understand how the championship leader of the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing ended up in that hauler, you have to go back to why he changed anything on his car in the first place. Denny Hamlin has not been good at Iowa Speedway. He finished 24th in 2024. He finished 24th again in 2025. Across both of his previous starts at the .875-mile oval in Newton, Iowa, he did not record a single top 10 finish. So for 2026, he did something that required a measure of humility from a driver with 64 career Cup Series victories. He borrowed a setup from 2311 Racing, the organization that had been fast at that racetrack. We tried to run something a little bit different, not unknown, Hamlin explained on his podcast. Other teams have run it quite a bit before. I wanted to lean a little bit on 2311. They had been pretty strong at this track over the last year or so. He was direct about why. I kind of wanted to lean on their setups a little bit more this time around since I hadn't had success at this racetrack quite yet. I hadn't found what that good feel is around here yet. So, I needed to put someone's setup that has run well and then let me learn from there. This detail matters because the first theory that circulated after the weekend was that Denny Hamlin had been experimenting ahead of the postseason. He rejected that directly. By his own account, the braking package in question had been run across various cars roughly 20 times and possibly more. The reasoning he shared with crew chief Chris Gale was straightforward. Neither of them intended to step outside their comfort zone once the chase for the championship began. If they were ever going to try a proven alternative, the window was now, not in September. His conclusion afterward was equally specific. I am pretty confident. The team, I believe, is pretty confident that it was a bad batch of actual brake pads. We believe the pads to be the issue simply because everything else is the same for all the other cars. If this is the kind of breakdown you want more of, the reason this channel exists is to get past the headline and into the rulebook. That is the entire pitch. Subscribe if that is what you came here for. Now, to Saturday. Within moments of the number 11 car hitting the racetrack in practice, the problem announced itself. Denny Hamlin turned into the corner and the brake pedal dropped to the floor. 2 laps in, by one account, 3 by another. Either way, the pedal was gone almost immediately. Crew chief Chris Gale recognized straight away that this was the type of issue that could end their race before the green flag ever waved. It was not confined to one car. Chase Briscoe in the number 19 machine began suffering the same symptoms, and his crew chief James Small arrived at the identical conclusion. At 2311 Racing. Riley Herbst and crew chief Davin Restivo were dealing with it too. The number 23 car of Bubba Wallace joined all 3 in the garage. Those teams spent well into the morning hours making adjustments in the hope of giving their drivers something they could race. James Small described the state of Chase Briscoe's brake pads on Sunday morning in a single blunt word: destroyed. Here is the detail that proves this was a package problem rather than random misfortune. Legacy Motor Club, the other Tier 1 Toyota organization, had no issues whatsoever. The reason was explained plainly before the race by number 43 car chief Austin Pollack, who said, JGR and 2311 run a different package than we do. Denny Hamlin went out and qualified anyway. That is the cruelty of the situation. The pads worked for a handful of laps at a time, which is precisely long enough to complete a qualifying run and nowhere near long enough to complete a 350-lap race. Sources differ slightly on exactly where he ended up on the grid, placing him somewhere around 30th. Chase Elliott, meanwhile, is confirmed at 32nd after crashing his car in practice. At that point, most viewers would assume a team simply bolts on a new set of pads overnight. They cannot. This is the part of the story almost nobody knew before last weekend. Iowa was an impound race. Once technical inspection is complete, the race setup is locked. NASCAR does permit teams to touch the braking system for genuine safety reasons, and it permits quite a lot. Teams are allowed to drain their brake lines, a process referred to as bleeding, without any penalty at all. They are allowed to change rotors if those rotors are cracked. Both the number 11 and the number 35 teams made that change. Teams are even allowed to change calipers, provided they accept a drop to the rear of the field for the start. What they are not allowed to change is brake pads. Not with permission. Not by taking a penalty, not by going to the back. Denny Hamlin laid out the logic himself. I knew that NASCAR typically lets you change your braking components when it comes to safety. Because NASCAR doesn't want you having brake issues. They don't want people failing brakes, blowing rotors. He continued, but what's interesting is that the pads are the only things the teams are not allowed to change overnight. The reasoning behind the distinction is genuinely coherent. Calipers, brake lines, and master cylinders are single-sourced parts mandated by NASCAR. Because NASCAR supplies them, NASCAR accepts responsibility if one proves defective and therefore allows a swap. Brake pads are not single-sourced. Each team buys whatever compound it prefers, and drivers select from a wide range depending on the racetrack and their driving style. NASCAR classifies that choice as part of the car setup, not as a safety component. Denny Hamlin summarized the trap precisely. So it puts you in a box to where if you've made the wrong decision or you have what we deem as defective pads, I can't get out of the box. The only legal remedy available was to go behind the wall after the race had already started, a repair long enough to remove any competitive meaning from the afternoon. That is the situation both Denny Hamlin and team owner Joe Gibbs carried into the NASCAR hauler. NASCAR operates an open-door policy for exactly this purpose, and both men used it. Hamlin's argument was not about lap time. It was about physics. He was trying to prevent a rotor from exploding or arriving at a corner with the car pointed dead straight and no ability to slow it. He described the danger of wiping himself or another competitor head-on into the wall. He also acknowledged fairly that NASCAR's counter position was legitimate. And that's their argument, right? Hamlin said. We do not want 36 teams having a qualifying brake pad and a race brake pad. Then he offered to be punished. Not the standard rear of field drop, something harsher. I told him I'd start on pit lane, he said. Just let me get out of this box. We have a major problem. And they were like, that's not the way it's written right now. He pushed further, volunteering a 2-race penalty. Start on pit lane at Iowa, start at the rear at Richmond Raceway the following weekend. His reasoning was that such a punishment is severe enough that no team would abuse the exception. That's enough to where you ain't going to be screwing around. No one wants to take that penalty. That's a really rough penalty, but just give some sort of avenue out if a mistake is made. NASCAR declined again. Hamlin's frustration crystallized into the cleanest line of the entire story. So that's where I wish there was an asterisk at the bottom of it saying, but we will use common sense. Then came the escalation. Hamlin floated the only leverage he had left, which was refusing to drive. I did my best in that hauler. I just laid out my case and I said, what if I just tell the team, nope, I will not go out on the racetrack with those brake pads? Absolutely not. I'm too old to be hitting this wall head on. Absolutely not. And the response, as Hamlin reported it, they said, well, we would make up a penalty and it would be worse than what it would be if you just came in and changed them under green. His reaction was resignation rather than rage. I was like, well, I guess I just got to go slower then. If I lose brakes, I'm just going to putt around the racetrack and end up however many laps down that I end up. This is where every other version of this story stops. It should not, because NASCAR has now responded on the record, and the response reframes the argument. Mike Forde, Vice President of Racing Communications at NASCAR, addressed it directly on the Hauler Talk podcast. He began by needling Hamlin and Dirty Mo Media over the framing, then conceded something important. Forde had said that after listening to the full podcast, he thought Denny Hamlin had actually handled it fairly, telling it from his own perspective but without distortion. Then came the substance. NASCAR's position is that nothing would have been invented because the tool already exists. By creating a new penalty, that's one way of looking at it if you want, Forde said. The other way of looking at it is, we have discretionary penalties in our toolbox. And that's what we were referring to. The mechanism is specific. Had the number 11 team walked out of that hauler and changed the pads regardless, that action would constitute disobeying a NASCAR directive. And that phrase is written language in the rulebook. Once triggered, it becomes a discretionary penalty, and NASCAR determines the severity. Forde openly floated the range. A 3-lap penalty, a 5-lap penalty, a 20-lap penalty, whatever officials judged appropriate. So both accounts can be true simultaneously. Denny Hamlin experienced it as an authority inventing a punishment to force compliance. NASCAR understood it as applying an existing discretionary provision. The disagreement is genuinely about 2 words, makeup, rather than about what would actually have happened to the car. Forde then volunteered the most revealing detail of the entire episode. During Monday's debrief, he asked his colleagues a hypothetical question. If NASCAR had relented and allowed the number 11 team to change its brake pads, how hot would the rest of the garage have become on a scale of 1 to 10? Brad Moran turns to me and goes, 10. And then Brian Goebel, our chief inspector, said 11. That is the honest answer to the common sense question. Common sense extended to one team on Saturday night becomes a precedent that 35 other teams will invoke on every future weekend. Forde closed by noting that nobody went scorched earth, that NASCAR feels comfortable with how it ruled, that further discussion is coming, and that it probably helped that Hamlin finished 5th. Which brings us to the race itself. On Sunday morning, Chris Gale changed the brake cooling ducts on the number 11 car in a final attempt to salvage the situation. That constituted an unapproved adjustment. The qualifying result was thrown out and Denny Hamlin was sent to the rear of the field. Gale himself had described the fix as a 50-50 proposition. It did not work. Hamlin's mental state before the green flag was the most human thing he said all weekend. This was the worst mindset I've ever had going into a race, he admitted. I never felt beat before a race started, and I thought I was done today. He had already lowered his ambitions, hoping cars would wreck so he could salvage a top 25 finish. The pedal hit the floor by lap 3. Chase Briscoe's failed midway through the second stage, and his description captures the rhythm of the afternoon. I would have a restart and it would be good for 5 or 6 laps, then right back to the floor. And I mean, I was just pumping nonstop all the way around the racetrack. Just had to white-knuckle every lap, Hamlin said afterward. Obviously not knowing where my car was going to land when I got into the corner. He was 18th by the end of Stage 1, 6th by the end of Stage 2, 5th at the checkered flag. It was his first career top 10 finish at Iowa Speedway and his 13th top 5 in 23 races this season. Chase Briscoe finished 6th. 2 cars with failing brakes placed 5th and 6th. Joe Gibbs was struck by what he saw afterward. I want to say this, I've never seen Denny that exhausted, Gibbs said. I think he drove his heart out. Then Hamlin delivered the line that traveled furthest. I'd retire at the end of the year if I had to do that every week, that's for sure. His actual verdict on the day, however, cut against the doom framing entirely. The team did an amazing job. I would take that day 100 out of 100 times. The retirement remark is not purely a joke, and this is where speculation must be labeled as speculation. Denny Hamlin is 45 years old, the oldest full-time driver in the Cup Series, and his contract with Joe Gibbs Racing runs through 2027. He has been consistent that it represents his final deal. He sits on 64 victories, has acknowledged that catching Dale Earnhardt's 76 is unrealistic, and has said he is comfortable with that. The succession plan already exists. Brent Cruz, 18 years old and working through the development system, is the driver Joe Gibbs Racing is building toward for the number 11 car. Hamlin's own timeline was essentially designed around when Cruz would be ready. The organization has not stopped trying to extend him. Co-owner Heather Gibbs publicly called him a spring chicken. His answer was to check back in 6 months. Whether a day like Iowa accelerates that decision is genuinely unknown. What is not unknown is the championship position. Denny Hamlin arrived at Iowa with an 84-point advantage over Tyler Reddick. He left with a 103-point lead over Ty Gibbs, who won the race and climbed from 4th to 2nd. Tyler Reddick's afternoon lasted 4 laps. Running inside the top 10, his car broke loose on corner entry and collected the Toyota of Eric Jones. Both slammed the outside wall and both were finished. Reddick classified 36th and Jones 35th. Reddick dropped from 2nd to 4th, now 120 points behind. His assessment of himself was unsparing. It's the type of stuff you don't do to yourself and you don't do to a teammate. Kyle Larson was eliminated as well, collected alongside Alex Bowman in a 4-wide incident on lap 149 after John Hunter Nemechek forced him up the racetrack. Larson finished 33rd, 18 laps down. Christopher Bell finished 2nd for the 7th time this season and the 4th time in 5 races. "This is what you call a bad second-place finish, for sure," Bell said. 3 races remain before the chase. Richmond Raceway comes Saturday, August 15th, a track where Denny Hamlin has won 5 times. The chase opens at Darlington Raceway on September 4th, and whoever leads at the end of the regular season begins with a 25-point cushion. That leaves one question genuinely unresolved. Should NASCAR create a safety exception for brake pads, or does any exception instantly become a loophole in which every team claims a defect? And specifically, was Hamlin's offer starting on pit lane at Iowa and at the rear at Richmond a reasonable compromise, or the first step down a slope NASCAR cannot climb back up?